We're putting the finishing touches. I think maybe another week or so we'll finish out this quarter. And we've been doing a class on how to keep fear from scaring us to death. And we've learned some pretty good things that the Bible teaches us about that. And it's not that we're not scared, and it's not that there are some things that there are some things we probably should be scared of. But it's more like, how do we keep the fears that we don't need to be having, how do we keep those from debilitating us and making us disabled? We find that when we learn these skills and we start looking at the benefits of them, the benefits of a life lived in faith are not just for me and not just for you if you're walking by faith. It's for other people in addition to that. Where Hebrews says, make straight paths for your feet so that the lame might not be disabled. There are people who are looking at us for encouragement and looking at us to see how a walk of faith looks like, and it has great benefits for those around us when we do this walk by faith we've been talking about during this quarter. I wanted you to hear this about Jesus. Isaiah had some things to say about Jesus, and he was quoting God, I believe. Isaiah 42, verse 1. He said, behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights. I've put my spirit on him, and he'll bring forth justice to the nations. And this will tell you something about his character. He will not cry out or raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. Or he won't be a sensation mongerer, more or less. And verse 3 says, and a bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. I think a reed was something similar to this. This is a piece of river cane, so it's probably not exactly what he meant when he said a reed. But a reed like this has a couple of uses. I mean, it's good for poking people with it. If you want to do that, I told Tyrone I was going to poke him if he fell asleep. But it's pretty good, decent, kind of a good fishing pole. You could make a decent fishing pole out of it. Or if you're easy on it, you could make a good walking stick with it. So it has some use. But if you set it down like that and stomp on it like that, and then you start trying to use that thing as a walking stick and lean on it, it doesn't do very good. That's a bruised reed. So I have to ask myself, what good is it? Not much to me, so probably what I'll do when I get done is throw it away. And that's what you do with bruised reeds unless you're Jesus. And I believe the smoldering wick he was talking about was a candle that burned oil. And when the oil runs low, the flame starts burning the wick itself and creates a smolder or smoke. And it's an irritant. Not only does it not burn bright or cleanly, but it irritates people because they can't see, and plus the smell of the smoke is not good. And so what you do with that lamp is you pinch it and smudge it out unless you're Jesus. And then you don't. Well, several years ago, I came to the startling realization that he's not even talking about walking sticks and candle wicks. He's talking about people. And so Jesus treats people a certain way, and then we're called to do the same. Yalom said, psychiatrist, he said it's the relationship that heals people. I'd like to say just a word or two about mental illness for a minute. The part of what I've done for a living across time is treat that condition or help with that. I'm not a doctor, but I've helped with it. So I've asked myself many, many times, what is mental illness? And I don't know. I've done an awfully lot of thinking about it, and I've done a lot of studying about it, and I've talked to a lot of people who are experiencing it. But what it is, I'm not really sure. And I know there are some manifestations of it. I know that it responds to certain things. And so I'm pretty sure that there's a biochemical component to mental illness. And I also think there's probably a social component and an emotional component and a spiritual component and an upbringing component. I think that it's possible to be walking in the grass when you're 8 years old and get bit by a copperhead. And then when you're 35 years old, you won't go into the grass even though there aren't any copperheads there. And it looks really strange to people who hadn't been bit by a copperhead. So it manifests these things, and we learn how to live a certain way when we're little, and then when we're old, it doesn't work anymore, but we keep doing it, and it looks weird. So, but mental illness manifests itself in several different ways, and things that I've experienced with people is that sometimes it's hard to put a sentence together in a way that makes sense to an ordinary person, or you might laugh at things that don't appear funny to others, or you might not laugh at something that everybody else thinks is funny. And so you can talk to somebody, and there are all kind of diagnostic things you can do to figure out, well, what's going on here with this person's brain. And it appears to be that mental illness has something to do with our brains being compromised in some way. And but what it is, we don't really know. But I've learned some things that I think are true that I haven't read before, and so I don't have any empirical evidence to support what I'm saying here. I just think it's true. And I want to offer it to you for your consideration. If I have a disease, let's say I have gout, or what gout will do, well, it'll affect a certain part of my body, won't it? What part of your body does a gout affect? Somebody said all of it, but more your joints, more or less. Arthritis, the same. What about if I have cirrhosis of the liver? What organ will that? Clearly the liver. All right, if I have heart disease, clearly the heart. Okay. So if I have one of those problems, let's say I have an and it hurts me. Well, in order to fix it, I will use my brain to think about it. And I'll reach some conclusions about it and say, okay, I've got to do this, this, and this, and that'll help me. And so I do, and hopefully it does help me. So that's the way we do with everything that's wrong with us. We think about our brain, we think about things with our brain and we reach conclusions, and then we're able to figure out what's wrong and hopefully fix it. So that's the way it is with all diseases that attack other parts of the body. Well, what part of the body does mental illness attack? The brain. Well, if that's the case, that being the case, you're in a world of hurt, because the thing you use to fix most problems is the very thing that is really hard that's being attacked. And so you can't use your own thinking to fix it. And so you end up living with somebody you can't trust. And that's yourself. Have you ever tried living with somebody you can't trust? Well, so people who suffer from mental illness sometimes have a concomitant manifestation that people call paranoia. But what that means is they're scared. Well, you're supposed to be scared. If the thing you're trying to fix yourself with, you can't trust it. And so then what I'm talking about are bruised reeds. And I've found that, I guess maybe 100 or so people a day come to the place where I work. And I've found that I can read somebody's chart and it'll have all these diagnostic terms in there. But if I walk up to a person and I throw my arm around his shoulder and I say, "Tommy, I am glad you're here, man. You are in the right spot. You are welcome. I'm happy to see you." Well, almost 100% of the time that person will smile back at me. And it struck me that his smile looks almost, if not exactly, like everybody else's smile. And I wondered, why is that? And so here's the conclusion I reached that I don't have any empirical evidence for. And that is that the guy's brain might be being attacked by some kind of disease and is compromised. But maybe his smile's not exactly coming from his brain. It might be coming from his spirit. Now, I know you have to have a brain in order to smile. I know all that. But I'm suggesting that perhaps the smile comes from some place that's additional to the brain. And so maybe his brain is compromised, but his spirit might be okay. Well, that's a relief to me, because I can't cure schizophrenia. But Yalom said it's the relationship that heals. So I don't know what mental illness is, and I don't know how to cure it, but I know how to alleviate the suffering from it, some of it. Because I'm dealing with a bruised reed, and it's my job not to break it, but to throw my arm around him and say, "I am glad you're here. I love you, and I'm on your side." So that doesn't cure anything physical, but it does alleviate suffering. And that's what we can do with each other. And so everybody here can do that. Well, the condition of mental illness is not a majority of the people, and we don't run into that condition. But I would suggest to you that we don't have to, because everybody here is a bruised reed. How much can you trust your own thinking? I have a wife, 36 years now. And I'm glad she's not here right this second. But here's the truth about Lindy. She is not sure she can trust me. And I get to thinking about that, and I think, well, you're absolutely right. You can't trust me because I'm not 100% trustworthy. So what is she going to do? I'm really strange to her, and she to me, we're opposites in a lot of ways. And so what's she going to do with this strange fellow who does weird things, who drives past his driveway because he was thinking about relativity or something? Yeah. And who can't remember what color the room was when you walked through it, except, well, what is she going to do? She can't trust me. What can she trust? I think what she can trust is, see, I can't trust my own thinking for everything because I can't figure everything out. But what I think Lindy can trust is God in me. She can't trust me, but she can trust God in me. And so she'll know then, if she knows that the God's in me, the Holy Spirit is working in me, she knows that, well, I might twist off, but I won't go very far and I won't stay gone very long because I'll come back to dead center, and that's what she can trust in me. I really believe, there aren't any real young people in here, but I really think that I've got a word of counsel to who you ought to marry. You ought to marry somebody who loves God more than they love you, and they love you more than anybody else. But the reason they need to love God more than they love you is because they need to be able to trust God with you, because you're not totally trustworthy. And that makes for a good marriage, I think, and a good life. So here's what else it says about Jesus. I'll appoint you as... Am I doing this, or what's going on? I'm okay. What am I supposed to do? I didn't hear it. So, okay. As a light to the nations, and I've appointed you to open blind eyes and bring out prisoners from the dungeon and those who dwell in darkness from the prison. So I think our job is to be like our master. Our job is to be like Jesus. And part of what we do is don't break bruised reeds. We don't smudge out smoldering wicks. And we open blind eyes. We bring prisoners out of the dungeon, and we bind up the wounds of broken-hearted people because we've been treated that way. 2 Corinthians, Paul talked about it, chapter 1, verse 3. He says that God comforts us in our afflictions so that we're able to comfort others in their affliction. And that's really what we're talking about, is helping one another. Well, so the things that alleviate suffering in mental illness are the very same things that alleviate suffering in our marriages and in our businesses and in our friendships. And it's trustworthiness, it's truth-telling, it's compassion, it's loving people. So we don't have to have clinical pathology in order to benefit from it. Everybody can benefit from it. I wanted to revisit Elisha one time. It's in 2 Kings. I think we talked about him in an earlier class, but I wanted to revisit him. The king of Aram, in verse 8 of chapter 6, was warring against Israel, and he counseled with his servants, and he said, in such and such a place shall be my camp. He said, okay, we're going to camp over here. And the man of God, which was Elisha, sent word to the king of Israel and saying, beware that you don't pass this place where the Arameans are coming down there. So the king of Israel sent to the place about which the man of God had told him, and thus he warned him so that he guarded himself there more than once or twice. So the picture he's painting is that the Arameans were trying to set an ambush for the king of Israel, and Elisha was telling the king of Israel, no, don't go there because the king of Aram is there. And that happened multiple times, apparently. Well, it made the king of Aram mad, and he thought he had a spy in the camp. And it said in verse 11, now the heart of the king of Aram was enraged over this thing, and he called his servants and said to him, will you tell me which of us is for the king of Israel? And one of his servants said, none of us. It's Elisha. He tells you, he speaks about things that you do in your own bedroom in verse 12. He tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom in verse 12. So he said, well, go and see where he is, and I'll send and take him. And they said, well, he's in Dothan. There's a town in Alabama named Dothan, but this is a different one. He's in Dothan. He sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night, and they surrounded the city. And in verse 15 is a poignant verse to me. When the attendant of the man of God, who was Elisha, his attendant, when he had risen early and gone out, an army with horses and chariots was circling the city. And his servant said to him, alas, my master, what shall we do? What do you think the emotional state of that servant was? I'll repeat it. If you say something, I'll repeat it for the benefit of the folks online. What do you think, Terry? Frustrated? I didn't hear. Terrified? Alas. That's a strong word. I think that his emotional state would be the same as mine would be if I looked about me and saw the odds were 10,000 to 2, or whatever the odds were at that point. I think he was really, really scared. So he needed some things. And it was funny that Elisha wasn't scared. Elisha prayed. In verse 16, do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Then Elisha prayed, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And then there was a glorious end to that story. These horses and chariots of fire, when do you think they got there? Yeah, the Bible doesn't say when they got there. But apparently they weren't visible to just everybody. So the servant of Elisha was doing something that was extremely logical and rational. He was looking at the evidence, and the evidence pointed to his destruction. He thought he was going to get killed. What was that servant's only problem? All he needed to fix himself was what? Say again? See deliverance. He just needed to see a little better. And when he did, he probably felt much better. Okay, were the horses and chariots of fire real? According to the scriptures, they were real. And I'm not sure they just showed up just so that servant could see them. I think they were probably there, and the servant was just able to see them. But the servant couldn't see him, so he was really scared. Isn't it true, though, that there are a lot of things that are very real that you can't see? What about thoughts, or heat, or x-rays, or justice, or love? You could pile all those in this room and take a picture, and all I'd see is a bunch of people. I wouldn't see any of those. But we all agree that they're real, but you just can't see them. And so the servant of Elisha's only problem was he just needed to see a little bit better. And then he was better off. So studying the scriptures here and teaching this, and being in a class like this, learning how to have faith and how to trust God, really in the base case, all it's doing is helping us see a little bit better so that we can have a more accurate view of the world and so we can live our lives better. It gives us hope. Well, you know that scripture says, as a mountain surrounds Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. I wrote a real pretty song about that. But that's that's a really neat thought to me. For me, in my life, things aren't usually that dramatic. I've never seen horses and chariots of fire around me. They're never that dramatic. So I don't know how to show these things to other people. But I have learned some things from my study of Scripture and from being around you guys and being in classes. And I've learned some truths that have helped me see a little bit better, and so I can pass it on to you. And I think that's how the Christian walk works. Part of what our job in our life is to help the other guy get through life, and we're able to do it with these things. So what do people need from me? What do they need from me? I hired a guy one time, very smart fellow. He still works for us. When he came in and interviewed, he was sweating really badly, and I couldn't figure out why. And he wouldn't answer questions directly. He was an IT guy, and we'd ask him a question like, "Can you do this, that, or the other?" He said, "Well, I'm not sure." But I knew he could because I knew something about him. What is wrong with this guy? I was wondering. Well, we hired him, and a little bit later, he was talking to a coworker, and he said, when I came in to interview, you know where he was interviewing was an inpatient psychiatric hospital. He said, when I came in to interview for this job, I thought my wife was committing me to this hospital. He said, I thought that she had conspired with the people in this hospital just to get me in the door. And if I could just get the locked door behind me, she'd have me. He said, I had determined that they might get me, but I'm not going without a fight. But he had to walk in behind a locked door to do the interview. And he said when he heard the door click, he said, "Oh, they got me." Well, why in the world would he be acting like that? Well, I found out that previous to him coming into the interview, he had been in bed in his pajamas for 2 weeks because he was too depressed to get out of bed. He didn't have a job, and he had experienced what he thought was a long string of failures, and so he was in a world of hurt right there. But I didn't know it. I could never tell in 1,000 years there's anything wrong with that guy except that he was sweating and he wouldn't answer questions. But I did not know what was burdening him. Well, I would suggest to you that we have a world full of people where you can't tell what's actually burdening them. There's lots of hurt going on, and so we ought to be nice. Because look at it. If I'm nice to somebody, it doesn't cost me very much. But what if they don't need me to be nice to them? Well, it still doesn't cost me much. But what if they desperately need me to be nice to them? It still doesn't cost very much, but it does an awfully lot of good. We don't break bruised reeds. We bind them up. We don't snuff out smoldering wicks. We blow on it, pour a little oil on it where it flames again. That's being like Jesus. So I get to be like Jesus by binding up the wounds of broken-hearted people, because when I learn how to keep my own fears from scaring me to death, where I learn how to see better for myself, then I'm able to make these smooth paths for my feet where other people can benefit from it, and I can pass it on. I wanted to read you something. I made A's in grammar. But this is a fiction story, but details of it have been lived out a lot in various people's lives. This thing is called Singing in the Dark. Tommy jumped and landed upright in bed, throwing the covers clear and looking wildly around. Printed blue pajamas covered his racing heart, and terror made him pant like a sprinter. A bear had been chasing him and had finally run him over a cliff. But instead of crashing to the rocks below, he had landed in his bedroom on his own bed with no bear in sight. Not sure whether it had been a dream, the child sat still as a statue, listening hard into the night for the slightest sound. Stars, brilliant in the darkness, let a soft glow into the bedroom, and the open window filtered the muted tones of a countryside springtime night. The sound of each rustling leaf and singing cricket magnified the boy's fear. His imagination peopled the backyard with horrible monsters that had dripping fangs and appetites that craved little children. A stirring of the leaves in the apple tree beside his window startled the youngster and filled him with dismay. Maybe the bear had somehow gotten up in the tree and was even now looking at him, planning its death-dealing leap to the windowsill. Wanting desperately to flee, but frozen to his bed, the lad shut his eyes, forcing tears down his cheeks. He sat quietly in the dark, a helpless little figure with no hope of rescue. Everyone else was asleep far away down the hall and could never get there in time, so he had to face the beast alone. The rustling in the tree grew more insistent, and the boy braced himself. Then the bear chirped. It was a soft little sound that didn't quite measure up to what a bear should be saying. Puzzled but still afraid, the child remained still. The chirp repeated, and then to the lad's great amazement, the bear broke forth in song. A beautiful, lilting tune that seemed to transport the night into another place. It hinted of dandelions in the grass, sunshine, dusty bare feet, and butterflies on the roses. It didn't sound bear-like at all. Immediately, the boy knew what it was. Tommy eased out of bed and crept slowly to the window. And straining his eyes in the starlight, he could just barely make out the shape against the skyline. And sure enough, not 5 feet from his window perched a mockingbird. 6 ounces of pure music wrapped up in a bunch of feathers, singing its heart out in the face of all the creatures of darkness. Surrounded by the night, not knowing and not caring who was listening, it sang one stanza after another with reckless abandon. On and on the songster trilled as the monsters cringed and slunk away in shame at its glory. Its music transformed the gloom into a soft, warm cloak that welcomed the boy into its protective folds. Mesmerized by the moment, the child forgot about bears. His heart settled back in his chest, the tears dried, and he grinned. If a little old bird wasn't afraid, then he sure wasn't going to be scared. He was asleep in moments. Well, Tommy grew up, but he never forgot the bird. He learned that people everywhere are scared and lonely, just as he was that evening, and they need to hear some notes of joy in the gloomy places of their hearts where monsters dwell and the nights get scary. People need to hear the reckless abandon of a free heart singing at the top of its lungs into the faces of all the beasts of despair. So now, wherever he goes, Tommy, the grown-up boy, makes sure that he does this one thing. He sings in the dark. Well, we can sing in the dark. It's our job to bind up the wounds of broken-hearted people. And when we find relief for ourselves, we become aware that the whole world needs the same thing. And we find ourselves in a position to where we can not break bruised reeds, not snuff out smoldering wicks. We can bind up wounds of broken-hearted people. We can set captives free. We can make straight paths for our feet. And we can sing in the dark. And we become then the aroma of Christ. We become the manifestation of our God in the world. And in a very real sense, we become God made visible to unbelieving people in hopes that they can come to believe in an invisible God.